ask something about climate change and how your party was going to address that, but I think that's been covered by several other questions. So my question is about immigration and asylum seekers. How would your party, if you were elected, how would your party make any changes to the current situation? So since it's about changes, I'll ask Mr. Drabkin, Mr. Gertler and Mr. Green. Alors ma question, c'est, j'allais poser une question sur le changement climatique, mais comme il y a déjà eu plusieurs questions à ce sujet-là, ma question concerne les politiques concernant l'immigration et les demandeurs d'asile. Alors je pose ma question à M. Drabkin, Gertler et Green.
Et on va commencer avec M. Drabkin.
As I said before, this country was built by immigrants. People came here from the four corners of the world and have built a magnificent country that's respected around the world as a beacon of hope. Many people in this room have come from other countries, and you waited long years to get here. You waited in line. Now you're making your contribution. What we've seen of late at the border that we share with New York State is the influx of a lot of people coming in illegally, making claims for refugee status. And in many of these instances, these claims aren't warranted. They have the right to make a claim in the United States, but effectively they're jumping the queue. They're refugees waiting around the world. They're immigrants waiting around the world, as many of us in this room did, to get to this country. Yet, the government of Mr. Garneau is allowing this to continue. It's costing us hundreds of millions of dollars. It's unfair to the taxpayers who are footing the bill. It's unfair to the immigrants and refugees who are waiting around the world, like many in this room did. And it's unfair to the claimants themselves who, in the middle of winter, risk their lives to get here. They have the right to a claim in the United States. There's no war in upstate New York, I can assure you of that. Yet, this government continues to allow it to happen with no end in sight. A conservative government will restore the integrity of our immigration system. We'll put immigrants and real refugees first and foremost. We'll make sure that they are brought to this country and that this abuse is put to an end once and for all. It's unfair to everyone in this room.
Mr. Drabkin, you're out of time.
And we got to put an end to it.
Mr. Gertler.
Mr. Gertler,
Yes, you.
thank you. Thank you for the question. I'm going to deal with it in terms of immigration and in terms of refugees. On the immigration side, the NDP takes the view that we have to address gaps in settlement services, that we have to take, and we all know it, you take a taxi and you meet an engineer who's driving taxi or a PhD in biochemistry. So we need to improve our foreign credentials recognition. And we need to prioritize family reunification, which means ending unfair caps on applications to sponsor parents and grandparents, which is a policy the present government is engaging in. We can talk about Syrian refugees, but the devil's in the details. And we need to take on the backlogs that delay reunification. After all, here in Quebec at least, we currently have a labor shortage. It makes no sense whatsoever to be putting barriers in the way of immigrants. On the refugee side, we need again to address the backlog and to increase resources for refugee settlement and integration. Probably the single most important thing we need to do, and this was a Harper policy that's continued by the Liberals, is to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement so that we don't have people who are refugees having to cross the border illegally for fear of being sent back to the United States, where they may or may not receive a proper process, and if, for example, they suffer gender discrimination, that will not be recognized.
You're out of time. Thank you very much. Mr. Green.
So the climate crisis means that the world is heading for a refugee crisis unlike we've ever seen in our history. And the Green Party believes that it's part of Canadian values to help those in need. So we do want to prepare our country to be a helping hand in the world to help those that are going to be fleeing the parts of the world that are going to be worst affected by the climate crisis. However, we're not merely about just sort of opening the doors and helping those in crisis come in, we also want to go to the root of what's creating that crisis. So first and foremost, that means taking real action to address the climate crisis, but it also means working to reform the free trade agreements and the international institutions that for decades now have been imposing austerity and environmental destruction on developing countries. So I'm talking here about the IMF and the World Trade Organization and some of our free trade agreements that we've signed that are actually better described as corporate rule treaties. And the other way we want to go to the root of this is by basically not following the Americans into their wars anymore, and to be a real voice of peace. I mean, Mr. Garneau was taking credit for welcoming Syrian refugees, and yet we are selling, the biggest arms shipment in Canadian history to Saudi Arabia that is right now committing genocide in Yemen. And this is creating a new refugee crisis. So,
Mr. Green, your time is up. Okay. Thank you very much. Our next question is, yes, sir, and following that is, did you have 395? Is that the number you got?
Yes, 395.
Great. So following that is 375. Does someone have 375? Yes. Do we still follow? And following that will be 394. 394. Someone have 394? All right. Please go ahead.
Okay, my question is on the role in the reformation of the Indian Act and how we're treating Indigenous peoples. I'd like to get the response of Mr. Garneau, first of all, to defend the record or what was done, Mr. Green and Mr. Dratkin. In terms of what will you do to improve the quality of life, the health care in the North, education in the North, which federal government is responsible for, and we still haven't, when I travel a lot around the world, we're still criticized heavily for this. And the IMF is in accord with the Indigenous people on what has to be done with climate change, removal of subsidies. The Conservatives promised in 2009 to reduce subsidies to zero for the oil fields by 2025. In fact, they've increased. So I'd like to get some response to that in terms of Indigenous people in petroleum subsidies.
Thank you. We'll start with Mr. Garneau.
So as I mentioned before, this government is the first government to really take reconciliation seriously with respect to the issues that you bring up: housing, education on reserve, boil water advisories. We are committing unprecedented amounts of government money to address these issues. Will it be addressed tomorrow? No. We have a lot of work to do to right the wrongs that have existed in this country for 150 years. We are committed to the 94 principles of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We are committed to following up on the recommendations of the murdered and missing Aboriginal women. So we are very seriously engaged in a process that will take time. And we met as cabinet with Perry Bellegarde, who represents the First Nations, with Nathan Obed, who represents the ITK, the Inuit, and with Clément Chartier, the Métis Nation. And yes, as cabinet, just before we rose this summer, and they said, yes, there's a lot of work to do, but you are making progress. And we are committed to continuing to make that progress.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Green next.
So I would disagree with Mr. Garneau on that. I think we've gotten a lot of lip service from the Liberal government and not enough action. It shouldn't take another 5 years to end the boil water advisories. And to talk about reconciliation, I mean, the most fundamental aspect of reconciliation is acknowledging that we have a historic nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous people. And that means respecting the rights of Indigenous people to control their own territories. And what we saw this summer was Indigenous people saying they do not want pipelines running through their territories, and the Liberal government repeating a very colonial pattern of interaction with Indigenous people by sending the RCMP in to take down those barricades. This can't even talk about reconciliation while we are taking those kinds of actions. And you know, the fact that Justin Trudeau had the nerve to mock an Indigenous activist who came in front of him, you know, speaking out about the fact that the water crisis in Grassy Narrows continues to go on after, you know, being there for years and years and years. I think we saw the true face of Justin Trudeau in that interaction with respect to Indigenous people.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Mr. Drebkin.
My Green candidate colleague and I may not agree on much, but we're certainly going to agree on this issue. You know, fundamentally, it's about respect. Mr. Garneau listed a lot of great achievements on the part of the government as far as reconciliation is concerned. But Mr. Trudeau had the audacity to mock a member of the Indigenous community who came forward at one of his fundraisers to raise the issue of the extent to which water can't be drunken at they cannot drink water at their particular reserve. Can you imagine that? They came forward to underscore this particular issue. Mr. Trudeau laughed them off and said, "Thanks for your contribution to our fundraiser." Now I ask you, does that demonstrate a seriousness on the part of this government? Mr. Trudeau is able to make the tears flow on command. He apologizes for a lot of things. In fact, he was a great drama teacher, and it shows in his daily actions. But when it comes to taking seriously the issues of communities and showing the dignity and respect that they warrant, he fails miserably. And I can see right through the act, and I think a lot of Canadians can too. The Indigenous communities must be treated with dignity and respect, and the issues must be addressed seriously.
Thank you very much. Our next question was I thought it was over there. Okay, so number